Hello, everybody. I hope you are enjoying some beautiful summer weather from wherever you are, unless you are Ed Rogers or anyone in ownership at MLSE. If that's the case, I hope you're getting rained on super hard. In fact, forget rain, I hope there's a Sharknado happening wherever you are. Masai Ujiri will always be the GOAT as far as I'm concerned. And anyways, that's all the basketball talk I have for you this month. Time to shift gears and focus on the thing we're known for, which is Ottawa real estate and bad jokes, yes? All right, so June was a pretty solid month in Ottawa real estate. It wasn't May. May was a banger, but June was a nice, steady, solid month. Also, some fun little thing that happened in June was that the CMHC, that's the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, they came out and announced that they've officially given up on their goal of returning housing affordability in Canada to 2004 levels. Believe it or not, that was a real thing, and as you can imagine, I got some thoughts on that I'll be sharing with you later, along with all the stats and a whole lot more in your July 2025 Ottawa real estate market update. Let's go! All right, so we're gonna tell you all about how the CMHC apparently just figured out how the economy works in the second half of this video. But for now, let's go over Ottawa's freehold and condo property sales stats for the month of June, shall we? All right, as always, we're gonna start things off with everyone's favorite little darling, and that of course would be freehold. Let's stop mucking about here and get those June 2025 freehold sales stats up on the screen for you now in 1, 2, 3, go. There they are. All right, so in June, we sold a total of 1,084 freehold homes in Ottawa. That's Ottawa. That was a sizable drop from the 1,209 sales we saw in May, the month that comes before June. But as mentioned earlier, May was a banger of a month, right? And so to see a bit of a drop off in June is not surprising. That being said, in June of last year, we sold just 931 homes. And in recent years, a typical June would see us sell somewhere between about 900 and 1,200 freehold homes in Ottawa, right? So all in all, this year's total of 1,089 sales, it's pretty solid. All right, now moving on. The average sale price in June came in around $830K, which is more than just pretty solid, it's excellent. All right, to give you an idea, our highest ever June average was about $833K in 2022, right? So we just missed setting a new all-time high this month. And prices right now are right around where they were at the tail end of our all-time peak, which was again 2022. Also, for what it's worth, June's average sale price was about $3,000 lower than May's average. For all intents and purposes, I'd call that an insignificant change, AKA it's pretty flat. All right, now Serge, what about inventory, you ask? Well, inventory was also basically flat in June. And as always, I'll remind you here that inventory is, Ollie, say it with me, inventory is, oh, Ollie doesn't pay attention to these videos. Inventory is a measure of supply and demand all in one. All right, you'll know next month, Ollie. Thank you. Yeah, he didn't know I was going to introduce him into this video. All right. so inventory. We're talking about inventory. We started the month of June with 2.32 months of inventory, and we ended it with 2.34 months of inventory. So again, flat, right? And 2.3-ish months of inventory as an indicator falls within the range we'd expect in a seller's market. All right, now speaking of indicators, our sales to new listings ratio also ticked up to about 55% in June. That falls at the very high end of the range we'd expect in a balanced market. Anything above 60% there is considered an indicator of a seller's market, right? And finishing up the freehold stats for June here, the average time to sell in June was 27 days. That's a small tick up from the 25-day average we saw in May. However, 27 remains within the range we'd expect in a seller's market, albeit just barely. I consider the cutoff there to be about 30 days. All right, so those are the freehold stats. Big picture, our freehold market remains quite strong in Ottawa. On the whole, I would classify it as kind of like a steady seller's market. I wouldn't say it's scorching hot by any means, but good properties are getting good traction. They're moving very well. It's not uncommon to see multiple offers or at least quick sales. And I'm also finding that in this current freehold market, there is a relatively high degree of predictability right now. It's pretty easy to tell what's going to move and what won't, as well as where you need to be on price in order to get a deal done, and that's whether you're a buyer or a seller, right? So there are some positives to this type of market for both sides. Everyone tends to love a little bit of predictability, right? So that'll do it for freehold. Now let's quickly peruse last month's condo stats before we get to unpacking one of the most ridiculous headlines I've seen in a long time, courtesy of the CMHC. So without further ado here, let's get those June 2025 condo stats all up in your face. Boom, there they are. All right, so in June, we sold 311 condos in Ottawa. That was down a fair bit from the 367 we sold in May, month that comes before June, and the joke I already made. 311 was also well below last year's June total of 339, and it's actually our lowest June sales total since 2015. But 311 is still on the low end of what I would call a normal June total for condos. That would mean anywhere between like the low 300s and the high 400s, right? It's not pathetic, it's just kind of mediocre, right? It's the Atlanta Hawks of sales totals. Right? The Toronto Maple Leafs of sales. Just kidding, the Toronto Maple Leafs are pathetic. All right, so we're going all in with the basketball references this month. Threw a hockey one in there for you hockey fans. All right, moving on. If you recall last month's update, the average sale price for condos was quite significant. Right? And that's because for 3 years now, condo prices have been flat here, which has meant that they've landed somewhere between about 410K and about 455K in pretty much every single month. Again, for 3 years now, but not last month, right? May's average sale price was 466K, and that marked just the second time in 3 years where the average price broke above that familiar 455K ceiling. Right? So in last month's update, we told you that we'd be very interested to see what happened in June in order to get a better sense of whether May's high average was just a blip or the start of an uptrend for condo prices. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in June, the average selling price for condos was, you've already seen it on the screen, so this is kind of anticlimactic, $425,000, give or take. We're right back into our old, faithful, familiar range. And hey, it's just 1 month, but for now at least, May's high average sale price is looking much more like a blip than a breakout. I'm sorry to all you condo freaks out there. All right, next. June also saw our condo inventory climb from 3.14 months to 3.36 months. All right, and what that means is that for the month, condo supply outpaced condo demand, which of course aligns with everything I just said about low sales volume and a drop in the average price. Now, 3.36 months of inventory, still technically within the range you'd expect in a seller's market, but just barely, all right? Kind of look at like 3.5 and up as being balanced. If you break condo inventory down by segment though, you'll find that townhouse condos only have about 2.35 months of inventory, so very low. Apartment style condos across the city have about 4 months of inventory, which is like solid, not bad at all. But then apartment condos in the downtown core have, like, so we're talking Byward Market, Centertown, those have over 5.6 months of inventory, and that's not great, right? That's in buyer's market territory, all right? So your experience as a condo buyer or seller will vary a lot right now based on your product type and your location, all right? So finishing up condos here, the sales to new listings ratio for condos in June was 47.6%, and the average time to sell was 40 days. Both of those stats fall into balanced market territory. And as I've mentioned in past updates, it's really hard to put like a neat little label on the condo market as a whole right now. But if we break it down, I'd say the townhouse condo market is between a weak seller's market and like a barely balanced market. The downtown apartment condo market is a full-on buyer's market. And then the market for apartment style condos outside of that downtown core, so again, Byward Market, Centertown, that market is mostly balanced. All right, so that'll do it for condos. And oh, by the way, I got a huge one coming up for sale in July. I'm sitting in it right now. Check it out, right? That's the view. And once we sell this baby, we're gonna spike that monthly average right up. All right, but in the meantime, now that we're finished with the stats, let's talk about the latest reason to make fun of the CMHC. All right, here we go. So the other day, I came across this headline. All right, I gave you time to read it. let it kind of sink in, all right? So at first, I thought to myself, this can't be a real headline, right? Like I must have mistakenly landed on one of those like satire news sites like The Onion or the Beaverton, right? But no, unfortunately for me and for Canadians everywhere, really, this was a real thing, okay? And so before I really go in on this, and I will, allow me to give you a little background. All right, so first, the CMHC is the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, right? And the main objective of the CMHC, the reason they exist in a general sense, is to help make housing in Canada more attainable, okay? And they do this by playing two very critical roles with regards to housing in this country, all right? First, the CMHC is a mortgage insurer for high ratio mortgages. Try saying that 3 times fast. In other words, they are by and large, the CMHC is by and large, the ones who make it possible for people to purchase a home with less than a 20% down payment. In many cases, as little as 5% down. All right, so now this is obviously important because it allows young Canadians, or really anyone that wants to get into home ownership, to do so sooner rather than later and start building equity right away. Now, the CMHC's second critical role is to advise on housing policy and to oversee and administer a number of federal housing initiatives and programs, right? So when the government in power is strategizing over its housing policy and deciding what to do in order to address a number of these housing related issues in Canada, the CMHC is not only at the table, right? They're often the ones leading the discussion. Okay, that's the CMHC in a nutshell, right? Like, sounds like they're pretty important, right? So there must be some really bright people over there, huh? Well, some time ago, these very bright people set a very important goal of building so many homes in Canada that it would, according to them, and I quote, bring affordability back to 2004 levels, all right? Why 2004, you ask? Well, it's because according to the CMHC, that was the last time housing costs were relatively affordable here in relation to income, all right? So, for those keeping score here, the CMHC, whose sole purpose is to help make housing more affordable, is telling us that housing has progressively gotten less affordable for the last, hold on, I gotta do the math here. I carry the 21 years. 21 years. Only in the Canadian government can you fail at your job for 21 straight years and stay employed. Am I right? And by the way, just to give you an idea here of what 2004 level affordability would actually look like. So I told you earlier that the average cost of a freehold home in Ottawa last month was about $830K. In 2004, the average cost of a freehold home in Ottawa was about $233K. So yeah, the plan, the master plan, just build enough homes so that prices came down by 72%. It's genius. It's genius. Why didn't we think of that? Why are we stopping there? Why not just keep building until homes are like free, right? Hell, at some point, they're gonna have to start paying people to take these homes off their hands, right? Let's just keep building. Right? And so that was the goal. We were going to more than double our current rate of housing production to 500,000 homes per year. We didn't really know how we were going to do that, by the way. And you know, like the most homes we've ever built in any given year in this country was 273,000 for what it's worth. And that was in like 1976. But anyways, we were going to figure out those minor details. All right. And we were just going to get it done somehow. And then that was going to bring affordability back to 2004 levels. That was the CMHC's brilliant plan to save housing, all right? But then, on a very dark day in June of 2025, the CMHC announced that it no longer believed that bringing housing prices back to 2004 affordability levels was a realistic target. You think? All right. It took them until 2025 to figure this out. Right? So like in 2024, they were still sitting around like, you know, like, okay guys, like it's not looking good, but you know, if we just make a couple of tweaks, you know, let's give it one more year. Right? But now in 2025, they finally decided it's time to move the goalposts. All right, and so the CMHC's new target is to now bring housing affordability back to 2019 levels. All right, and to give you an idea of what that would look like, in Ottawa in 2019, prices were about 42% lower than they are now. For Canada as a whole, prices were like 38, 39% lower in 2019 than they are today, okay? So I could probably just stop the video here, if I'm being honest. I assume you can guess where I'm headed with all this and just kind of fill in the blanks, you know, on your own, throw a few F-bombs in there, and hey, we got a video. But what the hell, we're here. It's a beautiful day. Let's keep going. All right, so as you can imagine, I've got some thoughts and I got some opinions on all of this, okay? So my first thought, and the prevailing thought as I read this article, was that the CMHC appears to be run by children. I mean, sure, like, you know, their naive optimism and their grade 6 level logic can be adorable at times. Like we all find it cute, right? But it's kind of like sitting your kid on your lap when you're driving the car, right? It's only cute until little Timmy yanks the wheel and sends you crashing into a lamppost. Right? And look, I know what some of you who've watched these videos for a long time are thinking, and yes, I know that I'm the build more homes guy, right? I still have the t-shirt, don't wear it anymore because I think the color red's just kind of gross now, but anyway, I'm getting sidetracked here. I agree that an increase to our rate of production for housing would help with affordability. I have no arguments there, okay? We absolutely have to fix our supply shortage if we're going to have any chance of making things better. But to think that an increase in production in and of itself is going to make housing 72% or now 40% more affordable is absurd, okay? This isn't a fucking banana republic having an end of season sale, right? Oops, we made too many houses, use code HOUSE40 for a discount. It doesn't work that way. And so these types of proclamations about bringing housing back to 2004 or 2019 levels tell me that the people responsible for guiding housing policy in this country don't really seem to know how housing or construction or basic economic principles work, right? And that is a concern. Now, contrary to what some believe, the profit margins on new home construction have not increased since 2019. It's the building costs that have shot way up, right? And so I would have expected the CMHC to be aware of that, right? And so when they made this grand declaration about bringing housing affordability back down to 2004, now 2019 levels, was the CMHC also expecting to renegotiate the price of lumber and drywall and glass and concrete and appliances and everything else that goes into building a home that costs way more today than it did 6 years ago, much less 21 years ago, right? Was the CMHC going to go out and meet with union leaders to convince tradespeople and laborers and architects to revert their wages back to 2019 or 2004 levels? And here's another thing. On one hand, you're pushing to more than double the number of homes we build, right? While on the other, you're saying that doing that is going to tank housing prices. I mean, if you're a developer, it's not exactly a convincing pitch, right? In the real world, right, when a product starts to rapidly lose its value to the point of no longer being profitable, the response is generally to produce a lot less of that product, not more of it, right? Oh, and hey, by the way, what about all the Canadians who already own a home, right? Like, what happens to them if values all of a sudden get slashed by 40, 50, 70%. Did the CMHC consider that side of the coin when they came up with this master plan of theirs, right? And hey, if this all sounds incredibly ill-conceived and like super short-sighted to you, you might be shocked to learn that I haven't even gotten to the best part yet. That's right, right? Do you remember earlier when I told you that CMHC insures mortgages? Well, in fact, almost 30% of Canadian mortgages are CMHC insured, right? And the total value of those mortgages, about $670 billion. So to put that into context, the CMHC is on the hook for an amount that by comparison is greater than half of Canada's national debt, right? $670 billion is greater than the combined market cap of all 6 big Canadian banks, okay? It's a lot of money. And by the way, these aren't just regular old mortgages that the CMHC insures either. No. They are high ratio mortgages, meaning there's very little equity in a lot of these properties. They are high risk mortgages, in other words. And so what that all means in practical terms is that if you were to buy a house with a CMHC mortgage where you only put 5% down, and then the value of that home dropped by 6%, you no longer have any equity in your home. In other words, your mortgage or what you owe on the home, the debt, is now greater than what the home is worth. You see where I'm going with this? All right, so in the example I just gave, right, where you put 5% down and your home's value drops by 6%, realistically, you're probably just gonna keep paying your mortgage, right? And it would make sense for you to do that, right? But now, what happens if instead of dropping by 6%, your home's value drops by between 40 and 70%? In other words, for how long do you think Jim from Toronto keeps paying his $800,000 mortgage once the value of his home hits $250K, right? And then what happens to Jim's $800K mortgage if Jim stops paying? Well, if it's a CMHC insured mortgage, then the CMHC has to pay it, right? And if the majority of people with CMHC mortgages end up in a situation like Jim's, where the values of their homes are so far below what they owe that it no longer makes sense to keep paying the mortgage, then what happens to the CMHC? Right? So these geniuses at the CMHC have literally spent years working toward a goal that, if they'd succeeded, would have rendered them insolvent and collapsed the entire Canadian banking industry in the process, right? You just can't make this up. I guess the silver lining here is that incompetence can sometimes actually be a gift. And this is one of those cases. Now look, now that I've laid all that out for you, did the CMHC truly fail to realize that they were essentially setting a goal to bankrupt themselves? As much as I like to shit on them, I have to think that on some level, they knew that affordability was really never gonna revert to 2004 levels. And I think they also know that in spite of their latest proclamation, affordability is also very, very unlikely to get back to 2019 levels either, all right? Unless something catastrophic happens. And I know people don't like to hear this, okay? But if housing prices in this country were to rapidly drop by 40%, it's not because of some great success, it's gonna be because something very bad will have happened here. And so when the CMHC puts out these sort of headlines about like fixing housing and then makes all these bold promises and proclamations, understand it's just political spin. The CMHC works hand in hand with whoever's running the country, and a big part of that job is to make Canadians at least feel like the people in charge have a plan and that they're gonna fix housing. And look, I'm all for giving people hope and letting them know that we're working hard towards making things better. And I genuinely believe that that is the case. I think people are working towards trying to find solutions. But the problem is that when you make these wild and like completely unrealistic promises, you risk causing people who believe those promises to make potentially harmful decisions as a result, right? So in a recent survey by the CMHC, no less, a number of Canadians who are currently renting, but who are in a position to at least consider buying a home, were asked why they ultimately choose to continue renting rather than buying. And the number one answer in that survey, and it was 40% of the people who responded, said that it was because they believed that prices were going to come down, right? So they're just waiting for prices to come down. Right? In other words, 40% of people think that they can time the market. And if history has taught us anything, it's that no one can consistently time the market, because none of us, not me, not you, not the 40% of people who are choosing to keep renting instead of buying, and certainly not the CMHC, none of us can know the future, right? And so when a federal housing authority like the CMHC puts out these reckless statements that essentially say that, like, hey, in the future, the cost of housing is gonna go down by like 40%. Right? A lot of people end up believing it, and then they make huge life decisions based on that information. So you have a lot of these people who may want to own a home, right? But who are thinking, well, hey, why the hell would I buy now when the CMHC says housing is about to go on sale, right? And so if the CMHC ends up getting it wrong again, then some of those people who wanted to buy a home and who could have bought a home but who chose to wait essentially on the advice of the CMHC could end up getting priced out of the market entirely and ultimately never own a home as a result, right? And so to me, that's just very irresponsible behavior on the part of an organization like the CMHC, right? To put that stuff out there. I could keep going on this for another few hours, but you know, we've all got things to do. And so I'm going to leave you with this. All right, I always like to end these on a positive note. So I firmly believe that when it comes to making big, important decisions, over the long run, you are going to be much better off relying on what we know to be true in the present, rather than basing those decisions on what you or anyone else predicts will happen in the future. All right, so instead of trying to guess which direction the wind will blow tomorrow or next month or next year, figure out how to get from where you are today to where you want to be tomorrow, and then chart a path to get there, right? And if you do that consistently, then the one prediction I will make for your future is that you're going to be just fine. All right, as always, thanks for watching. I'm Serge Papineau with the Papineau Group in Ottawa. I appreciate you, and I'll see you next month.